We're going to be in the end of James chapter 4 this morning. So if you look at that, you'll notice that since I think it was the last Sunday in January, right, we've made a lot of progress in the book of James. And I know we haven't talked about everything. I haven't tried to just go and, dissect every verse along the way, but I hope that we've kind of gotten some points to look at in James when we read it and study it and think through some of these things and notice the connection that's there, even though it seems like a bunch of little just pieces along the way. There's a great deal that ties this together. And we saw part of that last week where he talks about friendship, that idea of whether we're going to be friends of God or friends of the world, right? If we're friends with the world, we're at enmity with God. We become enemies of God. And so he's kind of explaining that a little bit, if you think about it, right? If you're really cognizant of that as an idea, he's been exploring that. And one of the ways that he explored it that we looked at the very end last week, I know we didn't talk about it a lot, but was that whole idea of pride coming in the sense of being a judge of the law, right? Where you're no longer attempting to figure out, am I doing what God requires, and spending all of the time looking at others and saying, you're not doing what God requires, right? So you've moved away. And that's kind of this issue that we're going to see. It's to me, this whole section, really beginning there in chapter 4, is exploring this idea of how worldliness can entrap us, right? Where if we're not careful, we can look up and realize, oh, maybe I am a friend of the world, because all of this stuff has grown up and it's now choking out the gospel in my life. And that might sound like Matthew 13, and it should, right? Well, anyway, that's kind of where we are this morning. We're going to talk about it, and you'll notice I'm bridging the end of chapter 4 with the beginning of chapter 5 because he makes two come now statements. And the first one in chapter 4, verse 13 is, come now you who say, right? And then in chapter 5, verse 1, it's come now, you rich. And so he has these two statements, these two come now statements. And what I found in the past is that a lot of the time, if we break it up, we spend a lot of the time at the end of chapter 4 talking about wealth and riches and rich people and their attitude and stuff. And then we turn around the next week and we come to chapter 5 and we spend the first 3/4 of the class rehashing all the stuff we brought up the week before, and then we only spend about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of class talking about chapter 5. So anyway, I'm just going to lump it all together. If we don't get through it, I think we still have an extra week in our quarter to get through that. So our plan this morning then is to look at this section. We're going to talk initially, in fact, I've just kind of talked about it, the problem of pride and how that comes into play in the Christian and tomorrow, right? So we're going to ask that, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, all that kind of stuff, right? How do we deal with that? And then he brings up the sin of omission, which in a way is a general principle, and so we want to know, why does he bring it up here? Why all of a sudden does he interject this? If you know to do the right thing and you don't do it, that's sin. Why? I mean, that kind of makes sense, but we need to ask the question, why does it come up here? And then we'll notice with those thoughts in mind how he culminates with this condemnation of the unscrupulous rich. And so that's kind of our plan this morning. And so if you will, read with me beginning in James chapter 4 and we'll begin at verse 13. So James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13, and we'll read through chapter 5, verse 6. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvester have reached to the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist. As we notice, that ending part begins to sound very Old Testament prophet-like. And we're going to notice that when we kind of think about it. But with that, that kind of firmly in mind, the other part that goes with it is that attitude, right? What was the attitude that led up to that? And that attitude, right, as I mentioned, kind of goes back to chapter 4, verse 4. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world is an enemy of God. And so this idea of God and His desire for the people and how they respond, we have to think about that in this sense of, do we ever get to that point where we're not just thinking about what the Lord's will is, but we're focused on what the will is, what God's will is for all of y'all. And that's kind of a different attitude. And so with those kind of thoughts in mind and the reading before us, let's take a moment and offer a word of prayer. Our great God and Father, as we think about your wonderful truths that you lay before us in your word, help us to open our hearts and our minds in a way that we would look intently at these truths and we would understand how we look in your sight, but strive to appropriate the truths of your word into the way that we live and act, and that we strive to see the good that should be done and lift up our spirits in a way that we would strive to accomplish your will and not let it lay beside. So be with us as we strive and hunger for the things that are true and right in our lives. Help us to defeat the evil that encroaches on our goodwill. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So again, I want us to think about in the sense of judging, what kind of judging has James been condemning? Right? James hasn't been condemning righteous judgment that Jesus talks about there in John chapter 4. He's talking about, oh, here's a rich guy comes in, let's pay attention to him. Right? Oh, we got to, it was all based on appearances. And a lot of what we're going to talk about is based on appearances. So we says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we're going to go into such and such a city and we're going to do what? We're going to go to a town and we're going to spend a year and we're going to buy and sell and we're going to make a profit. We can translate that, right? These guys had a business plan. And based on their market forecast or market projections and profit forecasts, they began to make travel arrangements to accomplish that. Right? That's what they did. We're going to go, because of our market research, here's a place that we can go. And based on this research, we can pretty sure by conducting our business, buying and selling this stuff, we're going to be able to turn a profit. And 1,000 years before James wrote this, there's a little town up there in Anatolia, and they found all of these clay tablets, and all of the tablets are cuneiform tablets, and they're all written in Akkadian. And the people up there didn't speak Akkadian. They spoke Hittite or Hitatsu or whatever they called their language up there, right? And they couldn't figure out why they were all here. Why were all these clay? Come to find out, there were these traders, not traitors, but traders, right? They were buying and selling stuff in Mesopotamia, and they were going up there, and they lived in this market town, and they were making a profit. And then they were going back to Mesopotamia, and they were buying a bunch of stuff, and they were going up to Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Anatolia, and they were going, and it's the same thing and so people have been doing it for thousands of years before James wrote this. People have been doing it thousands of years since James wrote this. What's the problem? There's nothing wrong with planning. There's nothing wrong with making a profit. They left God out of the picture. That's the problem, right? That's the other part of it. By leaving God out, the assumption was we're in control. Yes, you have something. I know it's just there.
Well, a couple things. So, outside of like what we would think is like biblical text, in the ancient world, most of what we have in Greek and Hebrew and all these things are actually trade texts for the most part. People move things a lot. And thinking about the situation that James is describing here, it does remind me of Paul to an extent. Because Paul's a debt maker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Paul had times he had to sit down and think, okay, if I'm going here, I need to make sure I can X, Y, Z just to support myself while I'm out here preaching and teaching and doing all these things. But that was never the end goal. Debt making was the thing that supported Paul in doing what his actual priority was. And I think that's what James is getting at here. This is a call to look at their priority. Okay, you want to go do these things. That's all good and fine. But what are you actually doing it for?
Because Paul said, right, that people should quit stealing and start working. Why? So that you have the means not only to support yourself, but to share with those who are needy, right? I think that's is that 1 Thessalonians or 2 Thessalonians? I think it's in 1 Thessalonians, right? Let him who steals steal no more, but let him labor with his hands that he might have that to share with those in need, right? So that's just kind of, and this is the statement, I have it written down in my notes for the chapter 5 section. The whole point is that the profit ought to be fruit and not purpose, right? Right? I mean, you understand that the limited goal is for profit, but the long-term goal is, what am I going to then do with the profit? Am I going to become a hoarder? Because if I become a hoarder, what happens to it? Rust destroy and moths eat it and that kind of stuff, right? It fades away. So those are the kind of the thoughts, it seems to me, that are tied up in this. So then he says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, right? We have to put God back into the picture. And so I like the word, I've got the NIV translation up here because as it is, you boast and brag. That's you glory in your vauntedness or something, some such thing. And that word for boast is the word glory. But the reason that I like this is because this other word was for a traveling snake oil salesman, right? I have one commentary who calls them a quack. These were the traveling quacks, right? These were people bragging there. That word that's translated in NIV as brag, that phrase, means somebody who promised a cure that didn't work, or somebody who promised to accomplish a task that they failed, or somebody who promised to tell you something and they never could tell you what they promised to tell you, right? And so that's what this is, right? So you can see how that is, and so he ultimately calls it what? Says all such boasting is, it's just evil. Now remember that there's not like shades, which we can deal with. Oh, well, that's kind of bad, but that's evil. Right? Really, when you're dealing kind of with both the Old Testament and the New Testament, the way the words are used, it's just there's right and wrong. There's good and bad. There's good and evil. And so we can't make those little, shades of, well, yeah, this is sort of bad, but that's really, it's fraud, right? That's the whole point behind this, is that it's boasting and bragging and none of it's the truth, right? And if it's boasting, Paul talks about boasting, but his boasting was in what? In the Lord. So, he wasn't claiming any of the credit himself. And as to the point that was just made up, if you look at the end of the book of Romans, Paul makes a lot of plans, right? I'm going to go pick up a collection, and we're going to go to Jerusalem, and when we're done with that, I'm going to come see you on my way to Spain. That was Paul's plan. He had a plan to do something, right? So his planning wasn't the problem. And I don't think any of us believe that Paul left God out of it, right? That I'm just going to push through with my plan, whatever God wants. He can just figure it out on his own. No, he's discerning that, this is a good way to go to keep spreading the gospel to places that the gospel had not been preached, right? That's why he wants to get to Spain. So again, the boasting and the bragging and all of this stuff, when it's without, and I want us to notice that it's if we live. We can get really tied up in the idea that it's God's will for me to have this particular job and this particular place and with these particular situations all surrounding it, and that's God's will for me. And God's will for me is to marry this person specifically and live in this neighborhood specifically and have this many kids and we're not really, some of those things we can control, but a lot of them we can't, right? All of a sudden the doctor walks in with news that starts with a C. And everything turns upside down, right? All of a sudden, the call isn't from the spouse, it's from emergency services, and you need to be at the hospital as fast as you can. Right? Those are things that we just don't know. Another thought that I kind of had that goes along with this is kind of that one is Psalm 14, verse 1. The whole of Psalm 14 is what this looks like, right? The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. I don't know how many people, when that was being written, really sat around thinking there isn't a God. It's more of a statement, I'm going to live my life as if there's not one. Because most agnostics I've ever met, they can say, well, I don't know if there's a God or not, but you live your life like there's not one. Right? So you might as well be you're a functioning atheist at that point. Because you say, I don't know if there is one or isn't one, but at the end of the day, you live like there isn't one. So that's that idea. And think of this in terms of kind of like Lot. What did Lot do? Lot judged on appearances. Oh, wait a minute. James wasn't talking about land deals, was he, up there earlier? Well, no, but, right? If we're getting judgmental and stuff, we can fall into some of those kind of traps where, oh, that looks really good. And that way, since it's so good, it'll be good for me. If I have a good environment to be in. I remember one of the first times I ever heard Ed Harrell. It was an afternoon at some lectureships, and he was talking about early on and a job he was thinking about taking, and somebody said, well, is there a church there? And he said, I don't know, but there'll be one when I get there. And that should be sometimes the attitude is I've got to make sure that where I'm going to go, everything looks good. And it was a mess for Lot. It ended up being an absolute mess for Lot. So again, those kind of things. And then, unless somebody had something there. I know I'm just running through stuff. Yes?
The way he frames if the Lord wills it, it's the same terminology used in, say, Matthew 6, the Lord's Prayer. Pray like this, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's actually, just looking at it real quick, it's the same terminology in Greek, almost.
Mm-hmm.
Spots there. I would think in some ways, like illusion, maybe. I don't know how far I go on that, but it just at least brings it to mind for me is, it's the same thing Christ kind of addresses there in the Lord's Prayer. It's the Lord's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I think James is touching on that here when addressing this.
And you get to the garden, and it's not my will, but thine be done. I do want to, I know I'm jumping ahead, but I do want to look at the passage. We're going to look at a couple of passages in Ecclesiastes. But Ecclesiastes 6, and I just have the one of the passages, I think. I don't have this one on the screen. Drop down just to verse 12. There's a lot more in this chapter, but just, verse 1, right? There is an evil that I have seen under the sun. This is Ecclesiastes 6 at verse 1. This is going to tie us also to the next section. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor so that he lacks nothing of all of his desires, yet God does not give him the power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. Now he says that's a vanity, and you be that way. But then drop down to verse 12. For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Which is really a key phrase in understanding the book of Ecclesiastes. He's talking about a lot of stuff under the sun, right? And how life looks when you just look at life under the sun. Ultimately, he's going to say, well, when you sum it all up, it's fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole. We insert duty because of the way our language functions, but it just literally says that's the whole of man. Fear God and keep his commandments. So anyway, then I want you to drop down to chapter 9 in Ecclesiastes. And this will sort of maybe feed something into our discussion of not omitting what should be done. In verse 1, but all this, so this is Ecclesiastes 9. At verse 1, but all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know, both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same events happen to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and to the evil, to the clean and the unclean, and to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. And then it goes on, and he kind of continues in that vein through this. And ultimately, the idea is that there are common things to happen to all people. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and let perseverance have its perfect work, that you might be complete and thoroughly equipped. No, I just jumped into another passage, and I thoroughly furnished unto every good work is Timothy. So life happens. Notice what he says. This is my 9/11, right? This is not I shouldn't maybe not 9/11, 911, right? This is something, the emergency that I always, when things get really bad, Ecclesiastes 9:11, right? What does Ecclesiastes 9:11 say? Happens to everybody. This is an evil that I have seen under the sun, right? Again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happens to them all. Those hands are in God's hand. Those times are in God's hand. But it's the eternal equation from God, and ours is this limited temporal view. And so we can't leave stuff undone. So again, it's kind of a general principle. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, to him it's sin. So that's kind of a definition of sin that we can understand. John had a different definition. He talks about it missing the mark, right? Not getting to that goal. That's the idea that's behind part of that. But here it's not, we're doing the things that are wrong. That's why we call it the sin of omission, or the sin, you can say sins of omission, but really lying behind it, it's the sin of I don't want to. Right? If we know the right thing to do and we don't do it, why do we fail? Because we don't do it. We don't want to do it. Remember, I had brought this up at the beginning of this class, the lady that my first congregation, and she talked about having to get her want to fixed. That there are times that we just have to want to do what God wants us to do, right? We have to really get behind it. And are we as enthused about doing those things that God would have us to do as we are about the fun and excitement that the world dangles in front of us? And what do we need to enjoy all of those things that the world dangles in front of us? Well, we need profit, right? We need to be able to generate some profit so that we can sit back and, double whammy. I brought it up in class Sunday morning, and then Jeff decides to bring it up in the sermon Sunday morning, and we're back to that guy in Luke 12, right? What did the guy in Luke 12 do? Look at me. I've got all of this stuff. My barns can't hold it. I'm going to tear down these, and I'm going to build bigger barns, and then I'm going to sit back, and I'm going to say, oh, take it easy. Kick your shoes off. Kick the Barcalounger into fourth, And God, right, how does the Luke 12 put it right there? Soul, right? The guy says, soul, you have many things laid up. Take your ease. And God says, this night, your soul. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world yet loses his own soul? That which makes us, that which makes me, me. That which makes you, you. And so, what responsibility does God want us to take in planning our lives? Again, I can't answer that question for everybody. I think the big thing is that we need to take some responsibility and not just kind of throw up our hands and, oh, whatever comes my way, que sera, sera. And we can approach life that way, but we can have a carefree life, but are we moving in the direction that God wants us to move? Other thoughts, comments, questions? Yes?
An example to me of a righteous planning is Joseph, who for years, he planned on storing up food as God told him to. He was doing the right thing for God. And also, when you think about the complexity, when the Israelites were moving out through, and they had this, all this stuff they had to plan for.
Right.
So it's not saying the plan's wrong, it's the heart, the humbleness, that it's all for God is what we have to make sure. Because even people that don't have a house on the hill, they can not have the right heart with what they have.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just going to real quick, and then I'll get to. I remembered that for a while, because of stuff that Cheryl did, we were kind of into, she more than me, into time management stuff. But I read some time management books. And of the time management books I read, I don't remember a one of them that said pray. Because I don't know that that's on anybody's radar, right? Time management, business, those kind of things where, did you think, we sing a song. Well, we used to sing a song. I don't know if anybody leads it anymore. When you left your room this morning, is that right how it goes? Did you think to pray? When you're looking at your calendar that's stapled to the kitchen wall, before you write something up there, have you thought about how does this fit in with godly living? Those are just things to kind of keep in mind. And we know those are the right kind of things to do, right? We know it's the right thing to do to keep God involved in our planning. But how often do the thorns and the briars of life come up and those cares of the world begin to choke out God's Word? So, I just thought maybe a rehearsal of some of the things in James for a couple of minutes. Right? Do the right thing. Don't fail. James chapter 1, beginning in verse 22, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own self. Chapter 2, beginning, what did I write down? Beginning in verse 14? Is that what I wrote? What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled, without giving them things needed for the body, what good is that? So again, James has been talking about this kind of stuff, right? We can go to chapter 3. Be not many of you teachers. What part of why was all of that? Well, it's don't be an ignorant teacher, right? Don't be teaching stuff that you don't know what you're talking about. And as a result of that, right, we're going to bridle the tongue. And I'm not saying that those are easy things, but they are the right things. We go on in chapter, right there in chapter 3. Verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you, let him show it by delivering long lectures for 50 minutes on how wonderful. No, No, that's not what he said. Write articles and post them online and get a bunch of followers and create debate. No. Show his works in wisdom's meekness. So we were supposed to receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save our souls. And that ought to come through, right? The meekness that we receive the word ought to come out in the wisdom that we demonstrate using the word. So anyway, go on and we were just kind of talking about that earlier. Verse 11 of chapter 4, don't speak evil against one another, brothers. So here's just the book of James. I was almost going to say, right, if you're looking for a topic for Wednesday night and you want a good sermon, well, there it is, right? There's the sermon. But it's those things. And Jesus talks about this, right? We mentioned that. If you look at some of these other pieces, Luke 12, we kind of mentioned this in a different way. But there in Luke 12, this is a different part of 12. This is later on in his teaching that Luke records in this particular section. So jump down in the 40s here. In verse 42, he's talking, we see the context. He's talking about, here it's the faithful and wise manager whom the manager has set over his household. So that's kind of the context. I just want to look at what he says in verse 48. But the one who did not, verse 47. And that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. And it goes on. Now, if you understand kind of the context of the discussion there, and they would have probably obviously understood a lot better than we do in those senses, but the manager had a responsibility that was given. He knew well what his responsibilities were. And so the discussion there is, the severity is based on knowing and not doing, right? He also talks about not knowing and not doing, but that's kind of the last half of that. The other one, it's kind of these ideas that are lead into the next. In Matthew 23, when he's talking to woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, right? I think that's this particular one. At verse 23 itself. So Matthew 23:23, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, you tithe mint and cumin, or mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Right? It's not saying that the tithing that they were doing was wrong. It's just that they were leaving the bigger stuff out, right? And then saying, well, look at how meticulous we are in the little stuff. And we can kind of get into that, right? That, we don't want to end up being really busy and yet having left our first love. Right? Then wasn't that, if the church in Ephesus was really busy, right? But they had kind of gotten tied up into stuff that had led in the wrong direction. Well, we can talk a little bit more about that. The next part of this, which we'll use as kind of the end of our discussion, is about these unscrupulous rich. And kind of the first part of the question is who's he writing to? That's if you didn't hear that, she said he's writing to the 12 tribes. So when we read this stuff here in the end of chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 5, even though he hasn't used this term brethren, these may or may not be Christians, but part of James's point is they ought to be, right? Well, everybody ought to be. But these were who God is fulfilling the promise for, right? He is writing to the 12 tribes. And so in this discussion, whether they're Christian or not Christian, it seems that he's writing to these Jews and how they're treating their fellow Jews, I think. I could be totally wrong. I mean, not necessarily just their fellow Jews, but how they're treating maybe Christians or whatever. There's all of that sociology that's tied up in that. But we have to back up and think, well, what can we glean from this? Right? Where are the relations of this mentality to what we can fall in? If we're all the way back up there and we become a judge of God's law, and we're looking at other people and we're going out and all we're worried about is making a profit, and we've left God out of the picture, and now we've been successful and we've got all of this stuff packed up in our barns. So we've kind of seen this movement in James of increasing worldliness. And this is where worldliness ends up. And he talks about stuff in here, right? Gold and silver corroded, right? Silver tarnishes, but we don't really think of gold and silver as like being attacked the same way that iron is and rusts like that. But ultimately, right, Peter tells us it's all going to go away. And the other thing to keep in mind is some of these statements are pre-AD 70 statements. So he's talking to some people who are going to feel the wrath of God. Because God's going to come and judge his people in AD 70. And then what? Well, Matthew 25, then the kingdom of heaven will be like. And what was the problem with what was the problem with some of the virgins, the 10 virgins that didn't have, 5 didn't, right? Oh, that's right. There were 10 virgins, 5 didn't have oil, 5 did have oil. And what was the point? They weren't prepared. They didn't do those things. And again, notice that all of them slept. The 5 weren't condemned because they fell asleep. All 10 fell asleep. Earlier in the Gospels, he'd been talking about keeping awake, being vigilant, all of those kind of things. Those are still important and true statements. But there were a lot of people that were listening to Jesus then and there that were going to be there in AD 70. And they still needed to be awake. We're on the other side. So now the kingdom of heaven is like this. We have the opportunity while it's today. Because we don't know what tomorrow may bring. And so what do we do? Again, not that we just throw tomorrow up into the air and say, well, whatever happens, I'm not going to worry about plans or anything. No, but recognize along the way that those plans might be out the window. And it might only take a word, it may only take a noise, right, of something smashing into you. Things like that. So, what happens to wealth in the past? So what's the bigger crisis? It's what they're treasuring up, right? In that last day, or in the last days. What's the future hold? Indeed, the wages of the laborer who had mowed your fields, that's verse 4. When we look at these passages, right, he talks about a couple of different things that they had done. And this one was really, we don't maybe understand this as much. Right? These were day laborers that he's talking about. What they received at the end of the day was going to feed them tonight and tomorrow morning. And then when they went to work the next day, what they got paid the next night, that was what's going to feed them that night and the first part of the next day. So if you hold that back from them, they're not eating. right? I mean, literally hand to mouth kind of stuff that he's talking about here. And then in a lot of the versions, we'll have it translated as Lord of Sabaoth, however you pronounce that, Sabaoth, which was a Old Testament term, right? The Lord of hosts. And that's talking about God's armies, right? His spirit armies that do his will. So God's not just by himself in that sense, not that there are other gods, but that spiritual host that goes with him. So he's, you know, if you look at, I just have this on verses 5 and 6, right? They had hoarded, they had kept back wages, all of that kind of stuff. And again, it's you have fattened your hearts, as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just, and he does not resist you. So he's talking about kind of this end state. And again, whatever your thoughts are, we're kind of out of time, but thinking in those terms about this, it's very right. This is like Amos kind of stuff or something, right? When we read this, but you go back and you look at Matthew 23, Jesus doesn't mince a lot of words either, right? So again, getting to the hearts of these kind of issues. So do you have other thoughts on that? Yes. Mm-hmm. It's just because when we view it as an obligation, because a lot of the times it's easier to figure out ways to kind of how can I get my obligations just over as fast as possible, and then I can go out and really begin living life, right? I get those obligations taken care of, right? And part of it we have to, right? I mean, we need to get up and do our chores and things like that, but this is in a spiritual sense, right? Let's get all of that spirituality that keeps us from living our worldly life out of the way. Other thoughts, comments on this particular section? I would just remind you, right, that these warnings are there. But one that I take to heart in this is that whole issue of Matthew 13 and how there's that whole group where it's the cares of the world, right? The allurement of riches, the plants were beginning to produce, and yet they get choked out along the way. Or I think about Ephesus, where we can look busy, right? But we've kind of allowed being busy to move us from who the Lord is and who He ought to be in our life. So next time we'll look at kind of the middle portion of chapter 5, that idea of our establishing our hearts. So we're gonna end up right there in verse 7 with a big therefore passage. So we'll kind of have a rehearsal of some of this that we've talked about and moving into establishing our hearts. Thank you again. I appreciate everybody's attention and participation.